We got a major storm here.
I make the weather. Oh, this moisture coming up out of the Gulf.
Do meteorologists actually control the weather? And is there any way that humans on Earth can modify or change the weather? You've probably heard a lot of opinions, conspiracies, and stories on TV and social media, but what's the real deal here? That's today's topic, weather myths and weather modification on Weather Legends. Hey everyone, welcome once again to Weather Legends. I'm your host, meteorologist Rich Von Owen, back at it here with our panel of legends. We've got them all today. We've got Bill Corbell, Joe Rayo, and Pat Pagano going to join us and talk about weather myths and modification. And the big question being, like Bill Murray said, do we control the weather as meteorologists? Do we make the weather? We're going to talk a little bit about this. We're going to go through both the modifications and the myths. And I just want to start because way back in the day when I was going to SUNY Albany, I actually had the the pleasure and the honor of meeting one of the pioneers of weather modification, Vincent Schaefer, up in the Albany area. He was an upstate guy. He worked for GE. He was actually born on the 4th of July. And throughout his career, he invented cloud seeding. This was what he did for many, many years and was able to, pretty much find a way to seed clouds and in many ways to enhance precipitation, which we'll talk a little bit more about throughout this segment. But that was one thing in my career that was kind of cool and kind of interesting. But there's so many myths and so many things that we see and hear from the public every day when, as meteorologists, we go and we talk about the weather. But Bill Corbell, you want to start out with one of your, discussions on modification of weather?
Okay. I had a very little introduction to it. Back in the Air Force, there was a problem at cold weather bases where in the wintertime, a plane taking off would essentially produce a contrail or something, or they would get some ice fog not the super cool fog, and it would close an airport down. So the thought was, gee, if we could put some dry ice into this super cool fog, we might clear it out so the planes can come and go again. So they gave us a little contraption to make CO2 pellets or pancakes out of fire extinguishers. Then they had us put it in the bottom of a balloon, which we let go about 20 feet, anchored to a truck, 20 feet, and we drive it back and forth. On those few days we're at Griffiths, upstate New York, we did get some super cool fog to see if we could make it go away. We didn't. But the concept was right, I think, Rich, and that's basically how some weather modification works. You go where there's super cool water, which is water but below freezing, and if you nudge it around just right, it can go into ice crystals, and that can become snowflakes, which can melt as rain on the way down. But what Mr. Schaefer, of course, went far beyond our rather crude efforts to get rid of fog.
Interesting, yeah. Pat Pagano, you go back a ways, during the days when there was, experiments and this kind of research going on with weather modification. Have you experienced anything like this, or any thoughts on that?
I remember, and maybe Joe or Bill will remember the hurricane. For some reason, I think it was Gladys that was actually circling around Bermuda. And they said, let's get the silver iodide crystals into the hurricane so we could weaken it and get it away from Bermuda. And they sent the plane in, dropped the silver iodide into it. It intensified and rapidly moved northeast away from Bermuda.
Wow.
So it didn't take it up, but at least it moved it away.
Maybe. Or maybe it
moved
itself. That's the thing. Right. You don't know what's real and what's manufactured. But how about the smaller scale, Rich, where you actually can make some rain out of a cloud?
I guess you could. In some cases, you probably could. The science is there. They do it out again west for the mountains to enhance the snowfall and help the ski areas out there. I have a nice graphic to show you with what they do out in the Rockies here. Is from the this is from the Idaho Department of Water Resources, and they basically have that ability to seed the clouds. I guess there's a release, there's a dispersion. And they can do this over and over again. I mean, they do it on ski areas basically with the snow guns. That's basically the whole concept of a snow gun. It's just, so it's not like, humans haven't influenced the weather, and like you said, Bill, in local instances, but on global instances. And maybe I'll go to Joe Rayo here. The atmosphere, the world, the earth is such a tremendous fluid that we see on some of these sites. We can see in high res now. I mean, Joe, you do the Joe and Joe show every night, and you show the synoptics, you show the nation, you show basically in some cases, how many micro details are going on with the satellite loops, the radar loops. You do the radar. I mean, it's complex, right, Joe?
Very, very complex. And in fact, that's the main reason why, if anybody wants to get a degree in atmospheric science, they have to go through a lot of mathematics, because it is very complicated to try to anticipate. And we have algorithms now, the supercomputers that try to forecast outward as long as, generally speaking, or generally available 15 days, although I know that in some cases the European model has been pushed to well beyond the normal limits. Sometimes we hear of a 30 or 40 day outlook, which is, in a way ridiculous. I mean, it's interesting, it's fun to look at, but don't put too much emphasis on that, because it ultimately is going to change, as the atmosphere always does. I remember when I was a very young boy, watching on NBC, Channel 4 here in New York, a series of cartoon programs. They were generally an hour long, and they covered various facets of science, space, and one of them covered meteorology. One of the hosts of the show, by the way, was none other than Oliver Wendell Douglas, Eddie Albert, and I forget who this other gentleman was. He was a rather he looked rather scholarly, and he always was in every single one of these programs playing the scientist, so to speak. And he always seemed to know everything about anything about everything. The weather presentation had a cartoon character by the name of Meteora, the goddess of weather. And I remember in one of those programs, that program on weather, that they spent more than a few minutes talking about weather modification. And the gentleman, again, who played the learned scientist, was actually warning about, let's not have man tamper too much with the weather, because, nasty things could happen, things that could be beyond our control. I recently saw a clip from that cartoon in a video concerning global warming and climate change. And the person who put that clip in said, you see, even back in the 50s, they were warning us not to tamper with the atmosphere. And look, where we are now. So it is an interesting subject. And one of the funny things about Dr. Schaefer that I remember, there was one of the very first, in fact, it was the very first passenger cruise to see a total eclipse of the sun. This was in the early 70s. So they rounded up a number of individuals, scientists and astronomers, and Dr. Schaefer was asked to be a lecturer on board that cruise, to which one person said, it seems rather imprudent, don't you think? And somebody said, what do you mean? He says, well, to have a rainmaker on board an eclipse cruise.
How about that?
If I was controlling the weather, I don't think I'd be sitting here doing this. I also wouldn't want the responsibility, because sometimes the weather is not what you want it to be. But seriously, weather modification, if it can be done, has benefits. You can put rain where you need it. You can maybe weaken storms, but everything is connected. If you increase the rain in part A, then someplace elsewhere might get less rain. So there are theoretical problems with that. Could there be widespread weather modification? If the Earth continues to warm, can we limit the amount of solar radiation coming in by putting stuff up in the atmosphere? In fact, there was some thought that, we'll talk about the contrails later, but with jet contrails, with more of them, we actually might be warming the planet, because the solar energy comes through the cirrus clouds or contrails, warms the Earth, but at night, that same cloud or contrail layer keeps the heat from escaping. So a lot of questions about whether it's viable. I mean, the energy involved in a thunderstorm or a hurricane is far beyond any kind of bomb we have. And to think that we can change all that? No, but large scale geoengineering, this is science fiction right now, but down the line, maybe you could do that. I just don't know, guys.
There are people out there who actually think right now that the government is controlling the weather and making the weather severe.
Mm-hmm.
And that's so ridiculous when, as Bill said, we don't even know to what extent at this point right now that the modifications are effective. We just don't know. And that is so ridiculous to even think. I remember when I was teaching elementary meteorology, I think they said that the energy of one average thunderstorm would be equal to that of an atomic bomb.
Or more.
So, yeah, so think about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I tell you what, to go over to Joe Rayo, the astronomy expert, I find that sometimes the moon or astronomical changes have more effect on the weather than almost anything on the planet. Can that be true, Joe, to a degree?
Interestingly, there was a gentleman who lived in the late 19th century, a rather distinguished professor by the name of Elias Loomis. And he wrote a book, a treatise on meteorology, in which he said that just like the ocean, because the moon indeed exerts a tidal influence on the ocean twice each day, the oceans rise and fall because of the moon's gravity. And he pointed out that we all live in an ocean of air, and that our atmosphere, too, may very well be controlled by the motions of the moon. And why not, perhaps, he said, if we were able to predict the tides, maybe with the knowledge of the orbit of the moon and its motion around the Earth, maybe we can use that to try to predict, and now we're getting into the subject of long-range forecasting, maybe we can use the moon to forecast future storms using, again, its motions around the Earth based upon, and, that was first put forward by a gentleman in the late 19th century, and now, today, I know of a few people who actually believe that such a methodology is possible and use the moon, and also, believe it or not, the sun and the planets and their gravitational influence on the Earth to make long-range predictions. In fact, one of them is a mutual friend of both Bill and myself, a gentleman who lives up in where I am in the Hudson Valley, Jim Witt, and he's been doing this now for a good number of years, almost 50 years. And I've had conversations with Jim about this and his methodology. And, he claims that when Mercury is in retrograde, we've heard that with astrology people. Oh, don't go out when Mercury is in retrograde, it's bad luck or whatever. And again, that's maybe we can call that meteorological astrology, but Jim actually inputs stuff like that into his calculations to make these forecasts, and I don't have anything, to say for or against that. The one thing I admire Jim is that he puts out a long-range calendar every year and sells it through a radio station here in the Hudson Valley. And if you're interested, all you need to do is just Google Jim's name, Jim Witt, Hope for Youth Foundation. That's the foundation he has founded. Every single cent he has made off of that calendar, that long-range weather calendar, he has used toward children's charity, to use his words, for kids who have been dealt a bad hand in life. Places like St. Jude's and Ronald McDonald House and innumerable other children's charities get all the money that Jim makes from this calendar. And I'll have to give him a salute on this. Up till now, since he started this in 1986, he has made over $6 million.
Wow.
And
good for him.
Incredible.
Very good. Yep.
I said, I'm not going to say one way or another whether the forecast is long-range outlooks that he's basing on the moon and the sun and the planets are correct or accurate. But I do say that if they were terrible, if they were inaccurate, he probably wouldn't sell very many calendars. He has sold all of these calendars every year. People keep buying the calendar. So I guess to a degree, those forecasts are correct. And again, he uses the methodology, again, as you pointed out, Rich, of the motions of the moon around the Earth, how much gravitational influence it exerts on the atmosphere, the planets, sunspots and warming and cooling of the atmosphere through that, if there is any. Again, I'm not into long range forecasting, but it's worked for Jim. He's made a lot of money for children's charities, and I think in that regard, it's just great.
Mm-hmm. You know what this leads me to think about? Myths that evolve out of this concept of controlling the weather. When I was at News 12 on my Facebook page, I get people talking about different things. One was this thing called a chemtrail. Have you guys heard of chemtrails?
Please.
Mhm.
You have.
Oh yeah.
Ron and Rich, if you can pull up that graphic for me with the contrails in there. But overhead, you see these white trails in the sky from time to time. Sometimes none, blue sky and none. Sometimes they're all over the place. Well, those are contrails produced by combustion of the jet fuel as these planes fly in a higher atmosphere. And part of combustion is water vapor. So coming out the back end of the engine is some water vapor and particles of combustion. It gets into this very cold atmosphere. The water vapor turns into ice crystals and leaves a trail behind it. And in the Air Force, we used to have to forecast for contrails because obviously if a plane is producing contrails, you can easily see where it is.
Right.
So knowing whether the contrail would be present or short-lived or extensive. And sometimes these things spread out over large areas.
Mhm.
And the conspiracy is that people say, well, they're spraying us. And here's the problem. First of all, if you're trying to spray somebody at ground level, you're not going to be doing it from 35,000 feet because who knows where that stuff is going. Crop dusters work 10 feet above the ground, so the spray goes where you want it to go. There is nothing to that concept. It's not a way to manipulate the weather or control us or anything else. That's just Mother Nature. In fact, you can go back and look for photos from World War II bombers and you'll see contrails. So it's a natural phenomenon. It just depends upon the amount of moisture in the high atmosphere, whether they're present, short-lived, or extensive. So that was chemtrails.
And Bill, sometimes you'll see these trails in a very odd formation. They'll be, not always like straight. They'll be kind of like circular, oval, even sometimes appearing to descend from top to bottom. I mean, is that just the physics of the curvature of the Earth?
No. What you're seeing is different flight paths. Here in the Long Island area, for instance, you have a lot of aircraft going overhead towards Europe. So they're going from west to east or southwest to northeast. You got planes going the other way. Different altitudes produce different amounts of contrails and show them going in different directions. So there's nothing peculiar about that at all.
Something else we've been noticing in the past decade or so is the increase in the volume of rocket launches across the world. Could that be influencing the weather?
Periodically, at Wallops Island, which there's a NASA base at Wallops Island, they'll send up sounding rockets which go up into the atmosphere 50, 60, 70 miles high, and then release canisters containing exotic chemicals like barium and trimethyl aluminum. And what happens is that the sunlight at that high altitude strikes these chemicals down on the surface from here on the ground where it's dark now. We get to see these chemicals glow in the sky. Some people sometimes mistake these for UFOs. One time, one of these rocket launches left a cloud of barium up in the sky. And at that moment at Riverhead, Long Island, they went into a power blackout, looked into the sky and started calling the police saying, I can see it in the sky. It's draining our electricity. It's glowing. It's expanding. But the main purpose for these launches is to study the upper atmosphere in what is called the no man's region. You can't effectively get up there using rockets because it fires right through that zone very quickly. You can't really get up there with balloons either, but you can, if you send a sounding rocket up and release these chemicals, you can at least study the magnetic fields, the upper level wind fields of the Earth by watching how these colors and the shapes of the clouds contort over time. And when I posted the announcement that such an experiment was going to occur and would be visible along the eastern seaboard, I got more than a few people who wrote to me on Facebook complaining, saying, here we are. Now we're polluting the upper levels of the atmosphere.
Mhm.
And one guy said, I noticed that trimethyl aluminum is a poison, and now they're poisoning the atmosphere. And I had to point out to these people, I said, look, the amount of chemicals that are being released into the atmosphere is very small, only a few pounds. And I said, we're talking about the atmosphere as a whole. It's like the equivalent of taking a tablespoon of poison and pouring it into the Atlantic Ocean. Is that going to do any good? Is that going to kill off any of the fish? Not likely. It's going to be very, very quickly.
Analogy.
Things with these chemicals that NASA sometimes uses to study the upper atmosphere.
There's basically no way to take, if there's a hurricane hitting the East Coast, some kind of big fan and blow it away. It's just not going to happen, right?
Well, that'd be a
why?
really big fan. We're talking about people thinking we're controlling the weather. There's something called HAARP, HAA, two A's, RP. That's not a misspelling. That stands for High Frequency Active Oral Research Program. It's been running for maybe 25, 30 years. And because it's located in the middle of Alaska, because it was initially a military thing, people have thought that it's doing some nefarious operations, when in reality, what it's trying to do is investigate the ionosphere to see its effect on such things as radio communication, GPS signals and satellite signals and things like that. But they attribute all kinds of things to this high frequency active oral research program that it just doesn't do. For instance, it has nothing to do with changing the weather around the world. People think it may affect, be able to control the weather. They think, I got a whole list here. Hold on, here it is. Here's what they think HAARP can do, some of the conspiracy theories. It claims the U.S. Is manipulating weather, causing earthquakes, and can control mines. Weather warfare, that we can change the weather around to steer hurricanes. Oh, there you go, steering hurricanes. Hurricanes got intensified. They can't do that. But this is what HAARP looks like. It's just a secret, not so secret now. It's run by a university system investigating the atmosphere, but we expand that to thinking we're controlling the weather or our minds, and we're really not. Someday, maybe, yes. As of now, forecasters still in business because we can't control the weather. All we can do is try to predict it.
Mm-hmm.